What if I told you some spirits never left their graves, and tonight they might be watching you? If you love ghost stories, hit subscribe, tap like, and share this video so we can bring you even more terrifying tales. Subscribe, like, share to keep the ghosts coming. London was a city of two hearts in 1888. One heartbeat with gaslight, brilliance, the parlours of Mayfair glittering with crystal and silk, the theatres on Drury Lane blazing with electric promise, the clatter of handsome cabs carrying gentlemen and ladies to late-night dinners. But the other heart, the darker one, throbbed in the East End, in Whitechapel, where the smoke never cleared, where hunger gnawed like a living animal, where the streets themselves seemed to whisper. It was not just a place, it was a labyrinth. Narrow alleys twisted like black veins through the city's flesh, leading to yards so cramped sunlight had long forgotten their existence. The air smelled of coal dust and boiled cabbage, of gin and sweat, and the iron tang of slaughterhouses. At night, when the fog came rolling in from the Thames, it felt as if the whole district were being swallowed by something vast and formless. And somewhere, in this darkness, something waited. The year was sliding into autumn when the first body was found. Mary Ann Nichols, called Polly by those who knew her, lay stretched out in Bucks Row, her throat cut nearly to the spine. The police who found her turned pale in the lamplight. This was not some drunken fight, not some robber's quick blade. This was butchery. Her abdomen was slashed open, her wounds cruel, deliberate. People whispered that night. By morning, they shouted, and within weeks, Whitechapel was living in fear. To understand the haunting of Jack the Ripper, you must first understand the fevered dream of Whitechapel. This was not merely a poor district, it was a wound in London's body. Tens of thousands crammed into rotting tenements, where whole families slept in single rooms, where disease thrived and morality starved. The streets never slept. There were markets that stayed open till dawn, gin shops that offered escape for a penny a glass, lodging houses where a bed could be rented by the hour, and always there were women. Women like Polly Nichols, women like Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Kate Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, living on the edge of survival. They were not simply names on a police ledger, they were lives on fire, flickering out one by one. Each had a story, a past, a reason to be walking alone at night, and something was watching them. Those who lived in Whitechapel began to speak of strange things before the murders became notorious. A butcher swore he saw a tall figure, all in black, standing perfectly still at the end of an alley, watching, unmoving, even as a cart passed between them. When the cart had gone, the figure was gone too. A lodging house keeper told of waking to a tapping sound on her window, as if fingernails were raking the glass. When she looked out, there was no one there, but she felt she would swear to her dying day. A shape moving in the fog below, darker than shadow. At first, these were just stories, told over gin to pass the time. London had ghosts enough already. The headsman's victims said to haunt Tower Hill, the spectre of the Black Dog of Newgate, the grey ladies of forgotten plague pits. Whitechapel could have its share. But when the killings began, the stories took on a new weight. The press was quick to seize on the horror. Newspapers printed every detail they could find, sometimes true, sometimes exaggerated, always selling out their editions before noon. They gave the killer a name. It was a letter, addressed to the Central News Agency, that made him famous. "Dear boss," it began, "I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. The next job I do, I shall clip the ladies' ears off and send to the police officers, just for jolly, wouldn't you?" The letter was signed, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." And just like that, the killings became something more. This was not only a murderer, this was a phantom, a name that grinned out of the headlines like a skull. To walk through Whitechapel then was to feel hunted. The city seemed to watch you. Gas lamps hissed like whispering throats. The fog thickened in strange ways, curling into shapes that looked almost human. Horses shied for no reason. Dogs howled at empty corners, and perhaps, something older than London itself had stirred. Something that had been waiting for a place like Whitechapel, a time like 1888, when misery was so thick you could taste it in the air. If Polly Nichols was the first crack in the dam, Annie Chapman was the flood. On September 8th, she was found in a backyard on Hanbury Street, her throat cut, her abdomen laid open, her organs taken. But what chilled the constables most was not the blood, it was the quietness. There were houses all around, thin walls, windows just feet away. No one heard a scream, Some said it was the killer's skill. Others said it was something else, that Annie had been silenced before she could cry out, that her soul had been smothered by something colder than death. And that was when the prayers began. Lodging house, women crossed themselves at night. Gin cellars kept candles burning long past closing. Children were told to stay indoors, though few could afford to. And the fog grew thicker still. On September 30th came the double event. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes killed within an hour of each other. Stride's murder was quick, almost incomplete, her throat cut, but her body otherwise untouched. Perhaps the killer was interrupted. Perhaps he had not yet summoned whatever dark ritual drove him. But Eddowes, poor Kate, Eddowes, her body told another story. Mutilated beyond imagining, her face carved open, her kidney taken. It was as though the killer was making something, shaping a message out of flesh, and the streets of Whitechapel seemed to breathe with it. By now, the supernatural stories had spread beyond Whitechapel. Some said the killer was not a man at all, but a demon wearing human skin. Others whispered of a surgeon who had made a pact with something infernal, trading souls for knowledge. There were those who claimed to see a man in black standing at the edge of every crime scene, always just far enough away that no one could catch him. There were those who swore that before each murder, they heard 3 knocks on their door, and when they opened it, no one was there. London was a city under siege, not just by a killer, but by an idea. The idea that death itself had taken human form and walked among them. November 9th, Miller's Court. What the police found there was not a murder scene. It was a vision of hell. Mary Jane Kelly was barely recognizable. Her room was painted with blood. Her body was spread out, dismembered, displayed as though the killer had taken his time, had spoken to her in silence as he worked. No killing came after this. Perhaps he was satisfied. Perhaps he had taken what he came for. Or perhaps he had simply melted back into the fog, waiting. The city breathed again in the months after. Though uneasily, life returned, because it must. But the shadow never left. And it is here, in this shadow, that our story truly begins. Because Jack the Ripper was not just a killer. He was a haunting one that has never truly ended. Whitechapel would never be the same. London would never be the same. And perhaps neither will you.
The murders had stopped, but the terror had only just begun. Whitechapel carried the weight of them like a shroud. Every alley seemed darker, every shadow longer. Even when no more blood was spilled, the streets still glistened, as though freshly washed with it. People spoke more softly now, not because they were no longer afraid, but because fear had become a kind of ritual, as though speaking too loudly might call the killer back. And perhaps it did. The fog became thicker that winter, pressing against the windows like a living thing, swallowing footsteps before they could reach the ear. Night watchmen swore they heard breathing where there was no one. Drunks claimed to see shapes coalescing in the mist, shapes that looked like women, bent and ragged, their throats yawning red, their eyes wide with something that was not simply pain. Soon, even the police began to feel it. Sergeant Stephen White, a seasoned constable, reported hearing a woman's scream one bitterly cold night, running toward it, and finding only an empty court. As he turned to leave, he saw writing on the wall, not chalk, not paint, but something darker, wet and glistening, a single word that looked like me. Before the rain washed it away, priests were summoned to bless the streets. Mediums and spiritualists were called in by those desperate for answers. Seances were held in cramped drawing rooms, where candles gattered, as if blown by unseen lips. Some claimed to have spoken to Polly Nichols, to Annie Chapman. To the others, they told of a man with hollow eyes, a man who smelled of earth and iron, a man who would not give his name, a man who laughed. What unnerved them most was that the messages always ended the same way, with silence. Then 3 slow knocks that seemed to come from the walls themselves. By spring of 1889, the hauntings had taken on a life of their own. A lodging house keeper swore she woke one night to find a woman sitting at the foot of her bed, pale and drenched, her throat glistening with a black shine. When she screamed, the figure turned her head all the way around, far past what any human neck could manage, and then dissolved into mist. A cab driver claimed that he picked up a woman near Spitalfields Market late one night, and she asked him, very politely, to take her to Miller's Court. When he arrived, she had vanished from the cab, leaving only a puddle of blood on the seat where she had sat. These stories might have been dismissed as superstition if not for what came next. On the anniversary of Mary Kelly's murder, Miller's Court filled with onlookers curious to see the room where the Ripper had done his worst. It was late afternoon when a young boy pressed his face to the dirty window of No. 13 and screamed so loud his voice broke. When they pulled him away, he could not speak for hours, only sob and claw at his throat. When he finally recovered, he told them he had seen a man inside, standing perfectly still, smiling, his hands dripping. The room had been empty, locked. From then on, no one would let their children play near Miller's Court, and when at night someone heard knocking on their door, 3 slow knocks, they did not answer. The fear became something almost ceremonial. Women would cross themselves before stepping out after dark. Men refused to walk alone, as though the streets themselves might swallow them. Even the butchers and slaughtermen, men accustomed to blood, would keep their knives sheathed before nightfall. Some claimed to see the killer himself walking still, not a man, but a shadow in human shape. He would appear at the corner of an alley, just at the edge of lamplight, then vanish when approached. His hat would be tipped low, his coat always long and dark, and his head would sometimes turn, just enough to reveal a flash of teeth. The hauntings spread beyond Whitechapel. A constable patrolling near the Tower of London reported that his lantern went out on its own. When he relit it, he found bloody handprints on the stones of the wall, where he swore there had been none before. In Holborn, a doctor returning home late at night was followed by footsteps that stopped every time he stopped. But when he turned, there was nothing until he caught sight of a face reflected in a shop window. A face that grinned back at him, though he himself was not smiling. London had become a city besieged by phantoms. It was no longer about the murders, it was about something deeper, something that had been let loose. The newspapers no longer needed fresh corpses to fill their pages. The hauntings were enough. One journal published a story about a seance, where a medium claimed the Ripper was not a man at all, but a creature, something summoned, something fed by misery and death. She said he had come through a crack in the world that only Whitechapel could open. A crack made wide by poverty, cruelty, and despair. And the more people feared him, the stronger he became. There were rumors of strange markings found near the murder sites, chalk symbols no one could identify, circles and sigils that some claimed were protective wards, others claimed were invitations. An occultist named Alistair Duvan wrote in a pamphlet that the Ripper's killings were not random at all, but part of a ritual meant to bind something terrible to the earth. He warned that if the ritual was completed, London itself might fall into shadow. People began to dream of him. Women dreamed of hands cold as iron touching their throats. Men dreamed of knives that glimmered like silver in the dark. And those who dreamed most often woke with scratches on their skin. Scratches that had not been there before. By the end of that year, Whitechapel had ceased to be just a place. It had become a wound in the world. A place where the air was too heavy, where shadows stayed too long, where every corner seemed to hold its breath. And in that wound, something waited, smiling.
By the time the next winter came, Whitechapel was no longer just afraid. It was infected. The fear had soaked into the bricks, into the cobblestones, into the very gas lamps that burned their pale, wheezing light. And now it was as though the city itself had begun to dream of the murders, dreaming them over and over, whispering them into the ears of those who could still sleep. The spiritualists said the veil was thin there, that too much blood had soaked the earth and made it porous, that something on the other side had noticed and would not leave. It was in one of those dim rooms on Commercial Street that they first tried to speak to him directly. A séance was arranged, not for curiosity, but for survival. There were 6 of them, a priest with trembling hands, a widow who had lost a sister to the murders, 2 men from the local constabulary, a well-known medium named Sarah Glass, and a silent man in a black coat who never gave his name. They gathered at midnight, lit a single candle, and joined hands. The medium called out into the darkness, asking for the spirits of the dead. The air grew colder until their breath missed. The candle guttered and nearly died. Sarah's head dropped forward, and when she lifted it again, her eyes were rolled back, her mouth hanging slack as though someone else were breathing through her. She spoke in a voice that was not her own, low, rasping, wet. "He is here," it said. "He is laughing." The widow cried out, demanding the name of her sister's killer. Sarah's head jerked, too fast for a human neck. "No name," the voice said, "only hunger." Then the table jumped, as though kicked from beneath, and something scratched across the wood, leaving marks that smelled of iron. When the candle blew out completely, they heard it. 3 knocks, slow and patient. On the door, the constables flung it open, but there was only the fog outside, rolling low, almost alive. When they turned back, Sarah was convulsing, her nails digging furrows into the table. They tried to shake her out of it, but she spoke again, this time in a whisper. "He is not finished." Then she screamed so loud the window glass cracked. When she came to, she had no memory of what she had said. After that night, the hauntings grew stronger. Stranger, doors would open by themselves. Chimneys would belch smoke when no fire was lit. A pale hand was seen reaching from a drain near Dorset Street, only to vanish when approached. And always, the sound of footsteps in empty courts. The rustle of a coat, the scrape of steel dot. It was no longer enough to pray. The people wanted action, a confrontation. Another séance was arranged, this one in the very room where Mary Jane Kelly had died. The walls had been scrubbed clean years ago, but the floor still seemed to breathe with memory. They drew chalk circles on the boards, set out bowls of salt, hung crucifixes on every nail. The air was heavy, pressing against their ribs. Sarah Glass returned, pale and thin as a candlewick. She warned them not to summon him, but they insisted. They needed an end. They needed to know if he would ever stop. She sat in the circle, her hands on the table, her lips trembling as she began the invocation. At first, nothing happened. Then the door creaked open by itself. Though no wind blew, the crucifixes on the wall turned upside down one by one. The table trembled. Sarah's breath came fast, her pupils dilating until her eyes were nothing but black. She whispered, "He is here." The temperature dropped so sharply that their breath smoked. Something moved in the corner, too tall for the room, a shadow with no source. It stepped closer, and the boards groaned under its weight. Then came the smell, not just blood, but rot, like a slaughterhouse left to fester in the sun. The silent man in black rose, holding out a silver crucifix, but the thing only laughed, not aloud, but in their heads, a sound like steel tearing. Sarah began to speak, but this time the words were not English, not any language they knew. They were harsh, jagged sounds, and with every one the candles burned lower. The shadow moved closer until it stood just at the edge of the circle. The priest shouted prayers, flinging holy water, which hissed as if hitting hot iron. The shadow recoiled, but did not retreat. Then Sarah's body arched, and her mouth opened wider than seemed possible. A voice came out, mocking and sweet. "You cannot cast me out," it said. "You called me here." The boards under the circle split with a cracking sound, as though something were trying to claw its way up. The constables dragged Sarah from the table, breaking the circle. The moment it broke, the room exploded with sound, knocking, screaming, glass shattering, crucifixes falling from the walls. They fled into the night, but even outside they could still hear the laughter, echoing from every alley. In the days that followed, those who had been there were never the same. The widow was found hanging in her lodging house a week later, her face frozen in terror. The priest took a train out of London and was never heard from again. Sarah Glass refused to speak of what had happened, but her hair turned white within a month, and London itself seemed to change. The fog was thicker, yellow and choking. Horses would not go down Dorset Street. Lodging houses reported empty beds where someone had been sleeping just hours before, as though the night had swallowed them whole. One man, a scholar of the occult, claimed that the thing they had summoned was not merely the ghost of a killer, but the killer himself, as something more, something reborn, fed by every telling of his story, every fearful glance into a dark alley. "He is no longer a man," the scholar said. "He is an idea, and ideas cannot be killed." There were sightings still. A woman swore she saw a figure following her, heard his boots on the stones, smelled the blood on him, but when she turned, there was only a shape in the fog, watching, waiting. Children were warned not to look too long into puddles after the rain, for sometimes they did not reflect the face of the one who peered in, and so Whitechapel lived on, not just with memory but with presence. Some nights, when the moon was thin and the air too quiet, a dog would howl, and all the windows would slam shut, as though by one hand. Those who heard it said it was the city itself crying out, or perhaps laughing. No more murders came, but it did not feel like victory. It felt like truce, temporary and fragile, as though the killer was simply waiting for the right moment to step back into the world. The air seemed to hum with it, a low, constant vibration, like a knife being sharpened just out of sight. The years passed, but the fear did not loosen its grip. Time softened the memory for some, but for those who had walked those streets, who had smelled the blood, who had seen the faces of the dead, the shadow never left. Whitechapel changed, houses torn down, alleys widened, lodging houses replaced, but there were corners that seemed immune to progress, where the air was always just a little too cold, where gas lamps flickered more than they should. People crossed the street rather than walk past Miller's Court, even after it was rebuilt. No one liked to linger there. It was said that on certain nights, if the fog was low enough, you could hear the faintest echo of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming closer, even when no one was there. Those who stayed too long claimed to hear breathing at their backs, a whisper like a sigh, and once, a thin metallic scrape, as though a blade had been drawn across stone. Some who heard it did not sleep for days, afraid they might wake to find someone standing at the end of their bed. Children grew up with the story as a warning. Mothers would tell them not to stay out after dark, or Jack will come. The name no longer belonged to a man. It was a figure, a phantom, a lesson carved into London itself. The very sound of it carried weight, like the creak of a coffin lid. And though the newspapers moved on, though the empire's gaze turned to wars and politics and royal scandals, Whitechapel kept its quiet vigil, knowing he was not gone. A curious man once came from far away, years after the murders, seeking the truth. He had read every report, studied every suspect, drawn maps of every crime scene. He walked the streets with notebook in hand, tracing the killer's steps, determined to solve the case. At first, he was welcomed. The locals laughed at his eagerness, his questions, his little theories about doctors and princes and foreigners. But as the weeks went on, the laughter stopped. He grew pale, withdrawn, began to startle at sudden noises. He was seen talking to no one, standing in alleys at night as if listening. One night he did not return to his lodging. They found his notebook on the ground near Mitre Square, pages soaked with rain, words scrawled into near-legible shapes. The last thing he had written was a single line: "He is not a man." They never found him. Strange things continued to happen. Knives went missing from kitchens, only to be found weeks later, buried point down in door. Laundry left on lines would be found slashed, hanging like pale bodies in the mist. A woman living near Hanbury Street awoke to find letters written in condensation on her window. "Me." The police dismissed it as pranksters, but the woman moved away the next day and never came back. In the years that followed, those who tried to dig too deeply into the killings met with misfortune. A writer working on a book about the murders fell ill and claimed that every night he saw a figure standing at the foot of his bed, watching silently. His health worsened until he abandoned the book. He burned his notes in the fireplace, and neighbors swore they heard laughter in the smoke. Even as the 20th century dawned, London could not shake him. The fog still crept in heavy as wool, and on those nights, the streets would fall unnaturally silent, as though the city were holding its breath. A constable in 1901 reported chasing a figure in a dark coat who seemed to glide more than run, turning corner after corner until vanishing completely. When the constable returned to the station, his boots left bloody footprints, though he had not stepped in anything. Decades later, when electric lamps replaced gas and the cobblestones gave way to pavement, people claimed the hauntings grew sharper, clearer, as if the new century had done nothing to dim him. Tourists came, curious seekers of the macabre, and some left rattled, pale, saying they felt someone following them. A few even reported cuts appearing on their arms or necks, as though from a razor, though no one had touched them. A journalist once stayed in a Whitechapel flat overlooking Dorset Street, determined to spend the night and write about what he saw. He recorded every hour by candlelight, his notes calm and rational until sometime past 3 in the morning. The last page was smeared, words written in a frantic hand. "He is standing behind me." The journalist was found at dawn, unharmed but insensible, staring at the corner of the room. He never spoke again. Londoners eventually stopped trying to explain it. They learned to live with it, as one learns to live with dampness or rats. Some even began to think of it as part of the city's soul, a necessary darkness, the shadow that made the gaslight seem brighter. But there were still nights when the fear returned, when the wind turned strange and the alleys seemed to close in, and on those nights, everyone hurried home, and still. There were those who swore they had seen him, a tall figure in a hat, a glint of metal in his hand, the faint smell of iron trailing behind. They said he smiled when he saw them, as though amused that they could still recognize him after all these years. Some never returned from those encounters. Others did, but they were changed, their eyes hollow, their voices thin, as if something had been taken from them. Even now, long after the last murder, long after Whitechapel became another part of the growing city, there are those who avoid those streets on foggy nights. There are still knocks at doors with no one waiting on the other side. There are still puddles that show a face that is not your own. And if you listen very closely, you might still hear it. The soft scrape of a blade, the faintest echo of boots on whetstone, the sound of someone just behind you, smiling. You might tell yourself it's only the city settling, only the wind playing tricks. You might tell yourself the Ripper is long dead, his bones dust in some unmarked grave. But London remembers, and the night remembers, and sometimes, when the fog rolls in and the lamps flicker low, you will too.